Hi there, I'm Davio, your podcast host of Future Forward. I'm here with Vincent, Chief Product Officer at IPG Mediabrands. Hi Vincent, how are you?
Hi, great. Happy to be here.
IPG Mediabrands, apparently a pretty large company. I didn't know it very well before, but you're also part of KINESSO, which is then a part of IPG Mediabrands. Can you tell me a bit more?
Yeah, well, it's a bit complicated. So basically, to start with what we're actually doing, if you think about any advertising or marketing campaign you see anywhere, like whether it's in movie theaters or a billboard outdoors or television or Facebook or
You mean the visual part?
Anything, the visuals, the text, the campaign, the tracking, all of those ads are basically, or let's say 95% of what you see in the world is created by roughly 5 companies, right? Yeah. Let's say Publicis, Omnicom, WPP. There are a few of those. One of them is IPG. IPG is where I work. IPG is a huge Fortune 500 company that consists of a whole bunch of daughter companies. Some of them focusing on creative, building videos and things like that. Some of them focus on CRM, PR. Some of them focused on media buying. Like how do you actually plan or allocate budgets across the different channels? How do you optimize that? How do you launch a campaign?
How many euros or dollars do you put in Google ads, or how much do you put in Facebook? And
which audiences do you target, etc. So that's Mediabrands. That's where I work. Mm-hmm. And Mediabrands then has a big, around 600 people, data and tech division, you could say, called KINESSO, right? So I'm looking after the product roadmap. What should we build? How should we build it within KINESSO for the Mediabrands agencies to kind of help them automate, improve, become more efficient.
All right, cool. So now you're at KINESSO, you're doing that, but your history of AI goes back quite a bit, roughly 15 years, I guess. You've started in a PhD in machine learning. How did it start for you, and where do you see it going right now?
Yeah, I think it's funny, actually. I think about 15 years ago, indeed, I started my PhD in computer vision. Back then, that was about tracking hands in real time in video, and the resolution of video back then was 320 times 240 pixels, super low resolution.
All right.
And it's funny because if you think about it, I spent 4 years researching something that today.
It was 4 years about that.
Yeah, it was. Okay. And it was a very tough problem to crack back then. But today, any student could hack together a solution over the weekend.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it's insane how fast
in high resolution. Yeah,
exactly. But anyway, so that's where I started. Back then, of course, there was no. I mean, at the end of my PhD, people started talking about like Boltzmann machines and like the beginning of deep learning. But at that time, that was not a thing. There was a bit of reservoir computing going on in Ghent University. But so back then, it was all still about random forest was the big thing and things like that. And then after that, yes, I joined Argus Labs, which later on turned into Sentience. Built out a data science team there, super interesting. Spent a lot of time on more like Bayesian filtering, signal processing.
And what did they do, Sentience?
So Sentience started out basically with using smartphone sensor data, accelerometer, gyroscope, location information.
So we're talking about 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
So we're really in the beginning of anything data and
exactly. And so they use that data to model human behavior, model the way you walk, detect who's walking, model or detect whether, based on the vibrations of your phone, whether you're in a train, a tram, a bus, which locations you visit, what is your driving behavior, etc. So that's where, and then that was mostly used for like insurance companies, for example, or loyalty programs at retailers or things like that. So that was Sentience, and then after about 7 years, I left Sentience. Sentience was in a great place. They're doing well, and so for me it was time to kind of look for the next challenge. And that's where I joined Mediabrands. Originally as Chief AI Officer. Mediabrands was, again, at that time, so let's say 4 years ago, it was kind of innovative for a big marketing agency to kind of hire a chief AI officer. You didn't see that anywhere else. But there was a vision that the Dimitri Marx, back then the CEO of Reprise, which is a subgroup of Mediabrands. And Dimitri, although he's been living in the US for like 30 years, I think, he's actually originally from Antwerp. But so we worked together back in the days at Sentience, and he basically said, if you do what we did at Sentience in the media world, in the marketing world, there are a lot of opportunities, right? So how do we reduce cost? How do we find revenue opportunities? And that's how it started. That's what I've been working on the last 4 years.
All right, and IPG is actually in New York?
Headquartered in New York, yes.
You're working from Antwerp?
Yes.
All right, so your team is fully remote?
Yes, I mean, it's a huge company. So Mediabrands is about 21,000 people in 60 different countries. A lot of our people are in New York because that's where we're headquartered. But quite some of my team are also in UK or different locations, so we're quite distributed.
Nice, cool. So you started with detecting behavior in images, which is indeed something. Yeah, if you now use ChatGPT or visual, it recognizes this whole room and everything. It went super fast. Now, at IPG, what are you doing now? Because everything is, I wouldn't say it's commodity yet, but it's becoming very easy. But still, a lot of companies struggle with actually creating value out of it. A lot of them are just, let's make our own ChatGPT, and everybody does that. But is that really where the money is or where the value is? How do you see that, and how are you tackling that?
Well, two things. Maybe first, I'll get to answering that question. But first, what do we do at IPG today? And well, the answer is mostly working on automating stuff. And so if you look at the marketing industry is quite old, right? And a lot of what happens there is still very FTE based, like manual, right? A client basically has a budget, we assign people, and the people do something for the client. But a lot of those things shouldn't be manual, right? And so what we're building is a framework where, if you think about how do you set up a media or a marketing campaign, first you define an audience. You figure out which people should I target, you do a bunch of research. Then, based on that audience, you plan your media budgets. I have X million dollars to spend. What do I put on Facebook? What do I put on billboards? What do I put on television? So there is an optimization process. Then once that is done, you have your media plan. You know what you're going to spend when and where. Then you start activating. You actually put those campaigns live in the platforms, right? And there are different types of platforms. And then there is reporting. And so historically, all of that was approaching kind of a very waterfall type fashion. You do that over the course of a few months' time, right? With a lot of people involved. But there's no reason to do it like that. And honestly, long term, you cannot keep doing it like that because signal is going away. Third-party cookies, Google is at some point deprecating them in the browser. Firefox already, Safari already don't allow third-party cookies anymore. So there is less information for advertisers to track about your behavior. iOS has a whole bunch of privacy guardrails. So the advertising industry is losing a lot of tracking capabilities, and that actually means that a big waterfall plan cannot be accurate anymore. So what you need is...
why can it not be accurate anymore?
Well, because if you have less information about what people are doing, then it's very hard to even use machine learning to accurately predict, how many conversions will the campaign deliver on this specific platform. If you don't have that underlying data anymore, right?
Okay.
You lose accuracy. So the idea is, instead of doing this big waterfall planning and going through the whole process, you want to repeat that whole cycle, not every 3 months. You want to do it maybe every 2 weeks. And to do that every 2 weeks, you cannot have people doing it manually all the time. So you need an integrated end-to-end platform.
And so your learning doesn't come from the cookies, but it comes from the results immediately then? Or how do I have to see that? What are you, because if you go to an iterative approach, you need feedback. And that feedback will allow you to optimize. What is your feedback signal then?
Also, there are two parts to it. One is, it's not just about AI, right? A big chunk of the effort is just hardcore automation, digital transformation, building data pipelines, making sure that you actually have an integrated platform. Forget about AI. That's the first step, right? Mm-hmm. I usually say, like, if you couldn't automate without AI, you cannot automate with AI, right? So it starts with kind of building the fundamental end-to-end platform. That's a core focus of what we're doing today. Second, then is, yes, where do you now start once you have that base layer. Where do you now plug in AI capabilities? Where AI is just a tool in the toolbox, right? To start, improving some of the functionality. And that gets to the second part of your question. So how do you actually unlock? How do companies unlock value when it comes to AI? How I see it, I typically kind of use a pyramid to visualize that with 3 layers. The top layer is product, right? You can build, and that's what a lot of companies do. A lot of companies today build shiny objects, a cool proof of concept. We also do that, right? Everyone does it. And you do a press release, and everyone's like, wow, that's amazing. But then if you look at it, that shiny object usually has 0 impact on the business.
It's a bit like the gold medals, the bronze medals in Paris. After 3 weeks, they're not bronze anymore. They're
exactly.
just ugly things.
Exactly. So that's the top of the pyramid. The second layer, how I see it, is process, right? There is a whole bunch of processes that typically in any big company can be automated, that people are doing manually, and there is a huge opportunity for cost reduction. An example, let me get to an example. The third layer, the bottom layer, is the people, right? And that is the most important one. It's maybe the least sexy, but it's the most important one in my view. And the reason for that is...
I was going to ask and why, but you're quicker. Go ahead.
If you really want... So what is driving your business? It is people. Mediabrands, 21,000 people, right? Imagine you can make all of those people a little bit more efficient. For example, you mentioned ChatGPT, so thought experiment. Imagine you just, you have a ChatGPT and you train everyone in your company to use it correctly. And I mean, use it correctly, right? Like many of us probably, I use it every day. I use it as a not as a chatbot, but as a personal assistant to brainstorm about how do I...
What is using it properly then? You mean having your a good initial prompt? Is that it, or is it? How do you see that?
I think it's more about so a lot of people see ChatGPT as a fun little thing to chat with, right? But again, you can treat it as an assistant. If I have to think about how do I restructure my teams, should I have a product manager in this specific team? I'm actually discussing with ChatGPT, right? And it's advising me. If I have to, typical things like create a PowerPoint presentation, right? I don't ask it to generate slides for me, but I do discuss like what would for this specific audience be the best structure of my presentation. And so you just really use it as a personal assistant. If you do that and you train everyone in your company, including HR, finance, software engineers, obviously, like every single department. Now imagine that on average, by doing that, everyone becomes maybe 10 minutes per day more efficient. Right? Every day they save 10 minutes of their time. So 10 minutes per day, if there are about 230 or something working days in a week, it's about 40...
In a year, you mean?
In a year?
Yeah. Or you have crazy weeks.
That's about 40 hours per year that you save, right? So 40 hours, it's a work week. So that actually means that everyone in your company suddenly is delivering an extra week per year with almost no investment or very little investment. If a week of time costs the company 1,500 euros, that's $1.5 million that the company just saved by becoming more productive, right? And that's just a silly example using ChatGPT. So imagine you start training all your people, arming them with what is out there instead of building little shiny objects, and actually helping them, improve the way they work. There is a huge opportunity there on the people layer, right? Then there is a process layer where you actually do have to build things, and then again you start. A lot of companies over the last 5 to 10 years went through a digital transformation process and built out their data warehouse and all of that. So that's great, and they're ready for that. If they didn't, it starts there.
So maybe first, what's an example of that process part at IPG?
Well, for us, it's jumping from the example I gave of a typical media process or pipeline is audience creation, planning, activation, reporting. Today, those are very siloed, right? So standardizing, once you standardize that process so that all the audience builders do it in the same way and all the planners do it in the same way, you can actually connect those two. There can be a data pipeline where your audience flows into your planning environment, right? Once that happens, you can start adding AI. How do we now add an example of what we recently released is a little front end on the audience part where people just chat with an environment saying like, these are the type of people I want to target. What would be a good way to do that? And so the AI model then uses the terabytes of underlying data to come up with the right...
terabytes of previous campaigns and previous audiences, or?
Partially, but partially also other data sets. So at Mediabrands, we have another company in IPG called Axiom. Mm-hmm. And Axiom basically has huge amounts of data about, in the US specifically, but also in other countries, but mostly in the US, basically about every person in the US, right? So about what is the household size of this person, what type of car does the person drive? Like they have this identity graph basically. And so if you know you want to target people that might be interested in electric vehicles, but don't have one yet today, and you know, they maybe need a certain income level, you just ask your chatbot, the chatbot starts digging into the data, puts together the attributes, the underlying attributes, and now you have your audience definition and an estimate of how many people you can reach. That now flows to the planners. And instead of the planners now looking at that and thinking about it, again, an AI model automatically starts using that information to do an automated budget allocation using historic performance data. Yeah. Right? And so this is where kind of AI is starting to automate and standardize a lot of the process.
And that's what you have already today, or that's what you're building?
Both. I mean, some of those components exist already. Mm-hmm. Some of it is still in the making.
So and in that way, you want to automate or facilitate that whole process. In the end, because there's at least on social media, the conversation on autonomous AI. I'm not sure if you follow that, but it's like the idea of the LLMs becoming, first it's more the assistants, like you're saying, but in the end that they become more autonomous. It's like often you see like similarly the maturity levels of a self-driving car, and where it gradually becomes more autonomous. Is that something that you believe in, and is that something that you also would see at IPG? So basically saying, okay, this is something we want to put in the market, figure it out, and start launching things. Is that, and do you even think it's feasible?
I do, or at least that's where we're heading. But you do have to build in certain constraints. So what I mean with that's where we're heading is the disadvantage of a large language model and just using a ChatGPT out of the box is whenever you ask it a question, no matter how hard the question is, it always uses the same amount of compute, CPU time or GPU time, to give you an answer, right? That's not how we work, right? If you give me a tough question, I need a minute to think about it, and a simple question, I'll get your answer immediately, right? And so that finite or that fixed amount of compute time means that your language model cannot really reason step by step about more difficult problems or break it down and iterate over it. And so that's where agents come in, right? So the idea of an agent is that you basically have your language model as an output. Well, your language model as an output doesn't necessarily have to give you an answer immediately. It might decide to output something, put it in another language model, right?
First create a plan. Okay, these are the steps we need to figure out the answer on that question.
Exactly, and that way you start having multiple iterations and maybe more iterations for more difficult problems. And on top of that, you then arm your language model with the ability to do API calls, right? So in our case, I talked about audience, planning, activation, reporting. Each of those modules in the platform have a well-documented API, right? So you basically expose those APIs with that documentation to the language model, and those are now tools that the model can use. So while it's thinking and planning to solve something, it starts calling some of those APIs. Suddenly it's doing
getting information to prepare its answer. Yeah.
So you might think like maybe the language model decides it needs to create an audience. It does a call to the audience module, right? Gets back an audience, then it decides, well, that audience is not what I was looking for. It does another call, right? And it starts iterating. Now it does a call to another module. And so you start turning a simple assistant into more of an autonomous environment or agent. A limitation still, though, is that all of that works for things it was trained on, right? It's very good at interpolation, right? A language model is great at kind of imagine the data you train it on, or like dots on a plot. You have an x-axis, a y-axis, just thinking in 2D now, right? And all the training data are little dots on that plot. Now the language model is great at interpolating things between those dots, so inventing dots that didn't exist between two other dots. It's really bad at extrapolating, putting a dot somewhere where there's no other dot in the neighborhood, right? And so that's I think like if we look at
so it's a bit like what I think it's Jan LeCun saying. It's a great like the fast thinking of what Daniel Kahneman says. It's very good at associations of things it knows, and it can go pretty far, but it can't go outside of its limits of knowledge. Basically, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where if you look at agents towards the future, a lot of research these days is going beyond language models and kind of going back to the old school symbolic reasoning, knowledge systems, graphs, and planning approaches, and then combining those with language models. So you basically have kind of a reasoning module that can really do new things, and then the language model that is almost your short-term memory. Right?
Yeah. And why are you convinced that it's because? I do still think it feels like a debate. Is it more than an association machine or not? It feels like you're completely convinced it's a very good association machine. Stop. Why are you so convinced?
Well, because at least up till now, there has not been any indication that a language model trained on specific data can suddenly invent something
which is
unrelated to that data at all, right?
Yeah.
There is also like mathematically, there is your loss when you train a model is to reduce the error on predicting what's in the data. It's unrelated to predicting anything that's not in the data, right? So a model cannot learn that. So we need other. And you also see basically, yes, there have been huge improvements in accuracy as we scale up large language models. But if you plot over time, the last 5 years, let's say, the size of language models and their performance, you see that it's starting to kind of converge asymptotically. So we do need something new. There is still a lot of headroom, right? Language models are still gonna improve a lot the coming years by scaling them up. But at some point, you're starting to use the whole internet and all the books in the world to train your models, and you still don't have a model that is capable of.
Yeah. So what you're saying is then large language models are now limited to what we as people actually already know, all of it, and as an individual human, it's impossible, but it's limited to what we already know. It won't help us get beyond what we don't.
Exactly. Okay. And that's not a problem per se, right? Because we're kind of talking about what we need in the future to get to like super intelligence, right? Versus what would be useful to completely transform the world we know. And I do believe that just scaling up generative models we have today will transform the world. You don't need AGI
because actually what you're saying is with that capability, we're already at more or less an average human being.
We're getting there. I mean, and just think about the impact on our economy in the next 5 to 10 years. So I gave the example of ChatGPT, saving 10 minutes per day, $1.5 million in this specific example. But there are other things like I only this week I actually saw a video of it's pretty cool of an 8-year-old girl that built without actually coding, that built completely end to end a Harry Potter chatbot from scratch, deployed it through Cloudflare, and built UX, the backend, everything, and used cursor.com, which is kind of a software engineering. It's being hyped a lot right now, but it's pretty impressive, honestly. It's kind of a, let's say, a co-pilot for software engineers. I mean, just imagine, like it's pretty advanced what that 8-year-old girl did. If an 8-year-old can do that, imagine what a seasoned software engineer can do today. Imagine what we can do in 5 years from now. Another example is like content production, right? Today you can create videos, high quality professional videos in a matter of hours, where typically it would cost you tens of thousands of dollars, weeks of time. You start, let's say, with generating some characters in Midjourney, right? Everyone played around with Midjourney, so now you have a few images. You can actually now get character consistency in Midjourney. So if the same person or same character in a few images,
comes back in the others,
yeah. Now you put that image in something like a Runway ML, right? So Runway ML is going to turn those images, and you give it a prompt into beautiful videos, right? Now you want those images to those characters to actually talk. To say things that you wanted to say. You use something like 11 Labs, which has like high quality voice generation or voice cloning. So you tell 11 Labs what the character has to say. Maybe what it has to say can come from ChatGPT. And then you want to do the lip sync. Now you want the character's lips to move, according to the text. So you use something like Live Portrait, another tool, right? And now you want a background song. So you ask ChatGPT to generate the lyrics. You ask Suno.com to generate a song. You put all of that together in an hour of time, and you have a high quality video of, consistent characters, different scenes. They're talking. There is music. It's insane what you can do today. And again, it feels like we're still in the days where only 3 years ago, image generation was pretty useless.
Yeah, exactly.
It was just fun. It was fun to play with, but not usable. That's where we are in a lot of areas. So just imagine what's going to happen in the next years, and the amount of economic value is gonna unlock is going to be insane.
You heard that, Reinout? Ready for it? Yeah, that's amazing, and it still feels like we are discovering what it's capable of in some way. It's a term, and I think I read it first in the mails of Jack Clark. I don't know if you know, he has a pretty good newsletter, and he calls it the capability overhang. Every time we release a new large language model, it's unclear what it will actually be capable of doing all. We don't know it yet. And I still feel we still don't know yet how far it will go. But maybe coming back to what you're doing, you say, so we have some of those components, others you are still developing. You believe in that more autonomy. What's holding you back today, or IPG, of not saying, okay, let's full force, and by the end of the year we have an autonomous process?
I would say, and I think that's the case in most companies, the biggest struggle is not technology, right? You could build what we're aiming to build and what we're building. You could do it faster. A startup could do it faster, or some investments could make it faster. But the struggle to really change a business is change management. You have 21,000 people that need to start standardizing the way they work, need to start realizing that doing everything in the same ways is for the good, right? People always think, well, the way I do it is special. It's a bit different for this client because this is my client, right? So it's a lot of change management. How do you standardize the ways you work in the business? How do you drive adoption of those tools? Much more than a technical problem. And that's exactly why, back to the pyramid, where building shiny objects is cool, right? And it shows the future potential of AI, but it doesn't change your business, because again, changing your business starts with the people. So how do you change your processes, your organizational structure, your way of working? And that's so much more difficult than building the actual tools.
Yeah. And how are you tackling that?
Well,
So you're in the technology part. I'm assuming that most people there are already invested, or okay, they're with all respect, but geeks or a bit of technology. We want to see this work. We all want to see that happen. But then you are part of a very big company. Is it also part of your role then to help the others understand it, or where is the biggest challenge? Is it also within your team? Is it in the larger context? Is that, because as chief product, I'm imagining that you have a role as well in that translation to the company. How does that work? What's your struggle there, or not a struggle?
I mean, you can only succeed. Again, it's AI is just a tool, right? That is the transformation going on today. If we forget about AI for a second and think about the big digital transformation that happened the last 10 years, again, going to the cloud, building your data warehouse, or data mesh, or data lake, or whatever it was. We're in a very similar situation, in the sense that driving such a big transformation can only work, you can only succeed if you have the buy-in of the business, right? So in the case of IPG, we have that, right? We have our Mediabrands CEO, we have the IPG CEO that is fully behind this, right? And that is not only making the investments, also helping the organization change. And so on the one hand, you have that bottom-up push of kind of coming from my team, right? Saying like, these are the products, look how amazing, start using it. But then you have very much that top-down
as well.
push, and that is super important.
It's both probably that you need for to be able
exactly.
to.
The majority of chief data officers or chief AI officers or chief product officers fail not because they cannot build the technology, it's just because they don't have the backing of the business, right? So again, it's that change management and that business backing and leadership understanding that is super crucial.
Yeah. That's what we see as well. I think what they typically see is it's a bit it's two waves and they start in parallel and they come together at some point, but you need to start them in parallel, going from top down, having budget, really making the decision to invest. And at the same time, creating a bottom up from the technology, but also in the company. Like what we regularly see is then we do discovery workshops. We people start getting access to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, some kind of easy access to a chatbot or to an assistant, like you say. It's indeed a better word, a co-pilot maybe even. So, and then the enthusiasm starts bottom up. People start thinking, but there's budget, and at some point they come together, the ideas and the budget, and then it needs to be translated in the company. One of the favorite things that I've seen there is, I think it's Satya Nadella that said it, like, they're now one of the most valuable companies in the world. And what he said as what he does differently, or what his focus is that they changed the culture from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all company. And I think that's really vital in all of this. You have that top-down and bottom-up, but all of them have to be ready to learn and to keep on learning. Because this goes so fast, there's constantly new things coming up and you need to master that. Is that something you feel as well? Is that something that you work on as a chief product?
I mean, learning, yes.
I'll come back also to your example. You say, what if you train those 21,000 people? Is that something that, how do you facilitate that? Is that something that you're actively working on?
It is, but it's not. So within Mediabrands, we actually have a learning and development team, right? We have a product marketing team. So those are our major stakeholders. We work with them to create training programs. We have something called KINESSO Academy, for example, where everyone in Mediabrands goes in to get trained on how to use all these tools. And
you help them to provide those trainings then?
Yes, and what we're working towards now is a certification even, right? So where people will, and that's where the top-down push comes from, where top-down, there will be a requirement for employees to get certified in those tools, right? And bottom up, we then work with those product enablement and product marketing teams to provide the training.
Yeah, I had a lunch a few months ago with Ethan Mollick, who is a professor at the Wharton Management School, and he actually even told me the anecdote that there's companies in the US that if you don't want to work with ChatGPT or anything alike, or even or an internal version, you just get fired. Because they really believe it's so vital. And his advice was to put in 10 hours. He says everybody needs at least 10 hours to experiment, because it's only at that point you start learning how it works. So I found it quite an interesting story to hear that companies are even firing people for that.
Yeah,
I hope it's not going that far at IPG.
I don't think it is, but it's really change management, right? And that means people, all of us are by nature averse of change, right? If something changes, whether it's an organizational structure or a process or a way of working, your first instinct is to be afraid or push back. Like, why? I've been doing it like this forever, right? This is how it works. Why would you change it? Oh, it's the global team again, that thinks they know better, right? But so it's about helping people to kind of step back, take a second, see the bigger picture, and hopefully start looking at change as something positive, something that is going to happen, everyone, and taking away some fears. Because if you talk about automation, first instinct is, well, what about my job? Let's say I'm a data scientist that manually creates predictive models for a client. You're creating now a product that's going to automate this. What am I going to do, right? What is my future? So change management is also about that, like explaining to people that we're not going to have less people in the future. We're going to have more, right? But the type of things you will do are just going to be more strategic. It's going to be more important and less on the delivery side of things, right?
Less repetitive, less. Yeah.
Exactly, and in today the way to excel in most companies is to be great at execution. The way in the future to excel at a company will be to have a great idea, and the execution will happen largely through AI agents. Right?
That's very interesting what you're saying, because there's also like a bit of a mantra or something that is often said in startup world, which is ideas are cheap, its execution is everything. Yeah. So you're saying it's going to change?
I think so, yes. And ideas are cheap, execution is everything today, right? Why? Because the execution of an idea is so complicated, takes so much time, takes so much money, and that's our bottleneck. That bottleneck, so when I talked earlier about how the impact of AI on the economy in the near future, well, that is exactly because this bottleneck is going to disappear, right? Executing on your idea, whether it's in software engineering or in legal or in HR or somewhere else, executing on that is going to be 10 times, 100 times more efficient and more simple, meaning that much more ideas will get executed, meaning that coming up with a good idea will be much more difficult and not be the simple thing anymore.
That's what you've been doing now, the past period. You've also told me something about the marketing mix model. I'm not a specialist, but it's about the different channels you use and how you optimize.
Yeah.
You've done that differently in the past. You're now doing it using large language models. Can you tell me a bit more?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just an example. So I talked about again the media process, right? Audience research, media planning, budget allocation, activation, reporting. As an example of how AI drives kind of efficiency and democratization of those tools, we could zoom into an example in the planning stage, right? So how does planning work? So a client comes in, X million dollars of budget, and we need to decide which of those, what part of that budget do we put on Facebook, programmatic advertising, display advertising, television, etc. One way to do that, historically or typically in the advertising industry, is using market mix modeling, right? So market mix modeling basically means you take the historic performance data. So you basically look at all the campaigns that have been running for that client in the last, let's say, 3 years. And you end up with time series. You have one time series that shows the spend, how much dollars did I put in Facebook, for example, versus, let's say, the clicks or conversions or purchases or whatever you're trying to drive through your campaign. And so you see my spend went up on Facebook and my conversions went up. My spend went down, my conversions went down, right? You find that correlation. Sometimes the correlation is not that clear. Sometimes there are kind of indirect effects. Could be, for instance, that there is a television campaign and people, when they see something on TV, they start Googling for it. And on Google, you actually have a search ad, a paid search ad, right? People click that search ad. So your time series now is going to show that if your television spend campaign budget goes up, the clicks on your paid search campaigns go up, but not the conversions directly through television because you cannot measure that, right? Anyway, so you finding the correlations between those time series and then trying to figure out which the spend on which channel drives conversions in what way is what market mix modeling is about. So historically, that's a very difficult, tedious, manual process where you have a bunch of data scientists involved that build a whole bunch of typically linear models, because you only have 2 or 3 years of data. You typically have daily data. How many conversions do you have per day? There are not that many days in a year, so you end up with 600, 900 data points. There's not much machine learning you can do with that, right? So that's why you use linear models. And so because of that, the delivery of a market mix model only works for clients that have a lot of historic data, only works for clients that have big budgets, because there's a lot of manual modeling involved, and still it's wrong, because it assumes a lot of linearity, while things are not linear in the real world. So that's an example of where we've been innovating a lot using AI, because now if you bring in something like a large language model or a big transformer model of some sort, you can start encoding world knowledge. Your language model doesn't need to learn everything from training data. Your language model already knows what television means, right? And it knows a whole bunch of things about the world. So you can now start learning from a lot less than 3 years of data. That's one. Second, you can start learning nonlinear relationships. Third is you can start automating. You can actually have your model build little machine learning models automatically without data scientists involved, right? So you end up with a market mix model approach, if you can even still call it that, because all the original features of being linear and all of that go away. But you have the same result with higher accuracy, fully automated. And so the outcome of that is that in the past, market mix modeling was maybe used for the top 10 clients. Today, market mix modeling is used for every single client. Even a small client with low budget, everyone gets a market mix model output. And that actually means that our teams can do their job so much better for all those clients.
And is it then like a very black box model? Or because the old approach might have the advantage that you can understand or more or less think you understand the relationships. Is this now a very black box model? Things go in and things come out?
It is. The model is black box because of the nonlinearity and its size. But we do, of course, because there are still humans that need to interpret it, so we do put a lot of effort then in trying to explain the outcome after the facts, right? Using typical explainability techniques and dashboards.
So what goes in is the same data then? What you put in is the same data as in the marketing mix model, which is the spend, the channels, and the world knowledge of the model. And what comes out is these channels, this spend. That's the output?
It is. But before you would build a model from scratch for every client, now you have a model, for example, that already knows how let's say the automotive industry works, right? And it knows typically what drives conversions in the automotive industry. So you start already with a model that is kind of, in a Bayesian way, you would say that has a strong prior on a bunch of aspects.
It already has an intuition. It already
exactly. And because of that, you just need less data to make sense.
Nice. So that makes it super accessible compared to how long ago? That's a year, 2 years?
A year and a half. Yeah.
So now almost every company, SMEs, have access to this kind of technology through IPG. That's the evolution that you're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are other examples. Simple thing like onboarding on your data warehouse. That's where it starts, right? So because, of course, all the tools you use need to get their data from somewhere. So when we have a client, we need to onboard them on our data warehouse, meaning we have to work with that client to get their Facebook advertising account connected to our Snowflake environment. We have to, build in an ETL pipeline to do transformations on the campaign names for that client, et cetera, et cetera. In the past, that was a super tedious effort. It would take at least 2 weeks, sometimes many weeks, to onboard a client. Now imagine you have 60 markets, maybe 50 clients per market, a week per client. It's going to take you 40 years or so to onboard all of them. So that's insane. That's impossible. So also there, what we've been working on is an AI-based approach where you basically you put a kind of a brief, a document in the system describing what are the platforms like Facebook and others that the client work with, what are what is specific to this client, how are campaign names set up, et cetera, et cetera. And the AI model then automatically reuses a whole bunch of underlying modules. You could call it stored procedures, but more modern version of that, to create a whole deck, a whole graph that represents an ETL pipeline. And so the whole client onboarding is reduced from a week to half an hour of time, right?
And it doesn't have to be reviewed anymore by an engineer?
Yeah, you do have to review it.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe 1 out of 10 times something goes wrong and we do intervene. But it's just another example.
So your process is still keeping a human in the loop, but it goes from a week to an hour, basically. Yeah. So that's divided. That's 40 times 40.
Exactly.
Divided by 40.
Exactly.
That's insane. Yeah. So now you don't do 40 years, but in 1 year you'll have all the
exactly.
All right, cool. So you see that democratization is then a very big element. How do you see that moving forward? Because I think it was Sam Altman that said, I'm seeing the first, what was it again, solopreneur unicorn in the next few years. Is that then also something that you believe which will be possible?
Yeah, 100%. And that's, again, what I meant with that, the economic value that will be unlocked through all of this. The future will be a future where, again, the big idea is more important than the execution. You will have people running maybe 50 startups or a $1 billion company, just by having big ideas and having agents execute all of it.
And maybe to be a bit less positive, I agree with it for the most. But at the same time, we're already seeing now that there's a bit of a disillusionment. Like, we had very big expectations, and I wouldn't say it's not all possible, but you still start feeling a sentiment in newspapers and in media that it might not be that big of a change. Why is that?
Because things take time. Again, the change management aspect, right? It takes time. I think what has been overhyped is the technology, right? We're in the sense that we're very far away from artificial general intelligence. We're nowhere near that. And that's what the hype was about, right? Oh, we're going to have, we passed the Turing test, so now soon we're going to have an all-knowing AI. We're not there at all. What is happening, though, is that slowly companies are starting to adopt what is available today. And that is, what is available today is enough to drive that insane economic value, right? But that just takes time because it means companies have to change the way they work. You see, there's this Belgian company in Ghent, I think it's Legalfly.ai, not sure about the name, as an example.
Legalfly and Henchman, both Ghent-based, yeah.
Yeah. That just as an example of just an application of generative AI in the legal sector, right? Where you now have kind of, an agent that reviews documents for you, that gives you legal advice. You have similar applications in the financial sector. Things will start popping up in the HR sector, in the real estate sector. So more and more things are being built and will start getting adopted, and that will drive that or unlock that economic value. But that just takes time, and it's not a big splash, the big hype of, we'll have a generative AI that out of the blue solves everything we're thinking about.
So you have the generative AI. It's not going as fast as we imagine, but you still believe it's heading there. What's the biggest? So you have the change management, but to me, it also feels a lot of companies often struggle with seeing where to invest. Is that something that you see as a challenge as well? Because today you can use AI in everything, from HR to sales to one of our customers said, we have 280 Gen AI use cases. So like, impressive. You're probably never going to build that, but okay. Is that a struggle? Is that something that you feel as well? And what's your approach to it?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I see it is as, I think people talking about that are asking those questions are asking the wrong questions, right? So as long as executives or boardrooms or are talking about AI or any piece of technology, we're in the hype, right? I think it's when people stop talking about those pieces of technology, about AI or anything else, and they just ask teams, please solve this business problem for me, right? That's what it's about, right? And then a team is going to think, well, how do I solve that business problem? Maybe AI is a tool in the toolbox to use that, right? So I think once we get back to actually solving specific business problems, we are again gonna see companies change much more than when a CEO says, oh, I heard about generative AI. My competitors are using generative AI. Please start using it everywhere. And then everyone starts building these shiny objects that don't do anything, right? So it's really about focusing on which business problems to solve, approach it from a product perspective, not from a tech perspective. And second, I would say enable your teams. And what I mean by that, and it's kind of happening organically already, is 10 years ago, referring back to Sentience, where I started as a data scientist. At that time, when you had to build something around AI, because AI wasn't really a tool in the toolbox back then, you kind of had to write it from scratch, right? You had to implement the algorithm from scratch, or you read a paper somewhere, you send an email to the author of the paper, and if you're lucky, they give you their code, and it's probably MATLAB code or something, right? So you have to port it to Python. So we came a long way from then, right? Because then a few years later, you had something like Theano. A few years later, you had TensorFlow, and then you had Torch, and you had PyTorch. And with all of that, the whole research community became much more open. All papers were published on archive, or everyone could access everything instead of being behind a paywall. And all of that basically turned the need of having a team of PhDs to deliver an AI model into the need of at some point having machine learning engineers still using like scikit-learn or something, into today having the need of just having a good team of software engineers. You don't need, for the majority of cases in most companies, to really make an impact with AI in your business. You just need a team of software engineers. And those software engineers have to know how to use APIs from Google Vertex AI or Amazon Bedrock or any of those. So also there is huge democratization happening from AI. And I think it's when both our engineers and our business leaders realize that AI today is not that fancy thing anymore. It's just a tool in the toolbox that everyone can use. Then we're going to start applying it in the right way and not just because we need a press release or...
I get it, but at the same time, people would say or feel that, but maybe we're missing out on something. Yes, you can start with business problems, but maybe we need to look at things differently because AI will be a complete net new way of doing things. And if you just focus on what you've been doing and augmenting it with AI, maybe we're not approaching it in the right way. How do you feel about that? Because similar to the process, okay, you can boost every part of the process, but in the end, the real value, if you unlock, is having the full automation. When not talking about AI, would that also happen? Would that also be possible?
Well, I think so, because what you need is a culture around innovation, right? In your company, and you don't get that culture by ignoring all the opportunities you know of and you have already, and instead bringing someone in, for example, to think big picture. What else can we do with AI? I think it just starts in your current organization. How do you start standardizing your current processes, start having your current engineers to leverage little tools of AI, start training your current HR and finance departments to use AI. And bit by bit, you're creating this culture of where AI is just not a separate innovation team, but it's just embedded into every single team. And that's where at some point, yes, there will be teams stepping up saying like, guys, if we would do something completely different, values get unlocked that nobody even thought about. But I think that's the last step. I mean, if you can start there and you have already done all the rest, that's fantastic. But very few companies have done just the basics yet.
Yeah, and if you're saying like it's software engineers, it's just they need to understand those APIs. I get it, but at the same point, what we notice is that even though they understand that, they often miss the intuition, the expertise of knowing, okay, it will be able to do this, but not be able to do that. Like there's often a bit of a the border between what's possible and not possible is not very clear per se. It's often something which comes with experience and then knowing how to unlock it. That's something we see as a quite a big struggle, because often then companies start thinking, oh, that will be possible. They don't have expertise, and then in the end, it's not possible. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your point that it's about experience, and honestly, the best. Yes, you can do. You can organize trainings and all of that, but the best way to get experience is to do something and fail, right, or succeed. An example actually that we had in one of our teams is. I really wanted us to hack in, a little AI feature in one of our products. Originally, the teams were a bit hesitant, saying like, we're not data scientists, we're software engineers. Should we get an innovation or a data science team to help us do this? I'm like, well, guys, you are software engineers. Here is the API documentation, right? Start building it. The team delivered it in 2 sprints, did a fantastic job. So now that team feels empowered. They're like, oh, well, actually, AI is not that hard to use. Now we know how to use it. We learned, we failed, and eventually, and eventually succeeded. But and it's just by doing things and gaining that experience that again you start embedding that. It's easy to just take it away and give it to a team that already knows how to do it, separate innovation team. But you just need to get everyone to the right skill set by have them do it. And an analogy would be the internet. When the internet came. The only way to really transform your company at that time, at some point, was to make the decision that everyone gets a computer that's connected to the internet. And yes, there is some training, but in the end, you start by doing. You wouldn't have a separate team that has internet access. And everyone, if you need to send a fax, you would go to that team, say, hey, can I use the internet for this, right? So it just starts by getting the tools in the hands of people and letting them, get comfortable with it.
So what you're saying is doing it yourself is the best way to learn it. Do you see a role then for other companies to help you with that? Or do you think that's waste of time and money?
No, 100%. I mean, coming from a startup environment myself, before I joined IPG Mediabrands, what you see is that in a highly innovative startup scale-up type of environment, you can go 10 times as fast as a big corporate. No matter how you organize your corporate, just because of the scale of it and the compliance and the processes that you have to organize a big company like that, you're always going to be slower, right? So in several cases, instead of building things ourselves, we actually deliberately decide to work with innovative startups, scale-ups, just because they can go so much faster. They can be up to speed with everything that's going on much more than we can as a big organization. So 100%, I think that type of collaboration is going to be very important, especially for bigger companies to kind of stay ahead of the competition.
You see, so IPG is actually a US-based company. You've worked for a Belgian company. There's a lot to do around the AI Act, the fact that Mistral is in Europe and might be in OpenAI, but I would say they're probably not as fast as OpenAI is for the moment. We have Aleph Alpha in Germany. It's a bit quiet now around it. How do you see Europe, US? How do you experience that? Do you have? I'm imagining you're feeling the difference. How do you see that, and how do you see that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is great at protecting its citizens, right? So that's starting with kind of the silver lining. What I do see is that when it comes to technology and innovation, it's so much easier to go fast in the US versus in Europe. You mentioned the AI Act, right? So that's an example of something where it sometimes feels like we rushed to a set of regulations because maybe that's a caricature, but because that's what we as Europe are good in. Like, let's regulate. The rest of the world is building, we're going to regulate. The result of that, well, first, let's think about it. That's not the result of the AI Act, but let's think about why of the $7 trillion companies that exist today in the world, why are none of those in Europe, right? What can we do to get some of those in Europe? We have the Digital Market Act, where Europe kind of tries to protect its. Maybe it started by saying, well, the big companies that they literally name, the big companies like a Meta, like a Google, like an Apple, need to follow more strict regulation because they have a monopoly, right? And they could kind of compete with our startups. Honestly, that has the opposite effect, right? Because what you see, again, in the US is that it is actually, especially those companies, a Google, a Meta, and an Apple, that drive innovation in the startup world. People coming from those companies, building on top of the models and technology created by those companies, generate, startups, scale up. There is VC money going around. It all starts with those FANG companies or the likes. So the question is of a DMA Act, for example, does it really protect us or does it even slow us down further, right? The second then is the AI Act that you mentioned. Well, to give you an example of one of the things that is in there, in the AI Act, Europe basically distinguishes, let's say, risky AI applications.
It's a risk-based approach, like
versus
high
non-risky.
risk,
Exactly.
medium risk, low risk, and no risk.
Exactly. And the high risk ones then come with a whole bunch of strict testing and reporting needs, etc. Now, what is high risk? So the Act talks about a bunch of things like surveillance applications and whatever, military applications, those type of things. Totally agree. It's great to have that. Another thing that they call high risk is training any model that uses more than 10 to the 25 floating point operations, right? Yeah. Now, imagine how insane it is to put a number like that in an act. Imagine in the 90s, 1990, CPU power on average was like 100 megahertz, right? Only 10 years later, we were at a gigahertz. Mm-hmm. Imagine at that time, we would introduce an act that says, oh, we went to 1,000 megahertz. Now you can simulate atomic weapons, molecules, whatever, chemical weapons. This is dangerous. We're going to prohibit, or at least make it much more difficult to do anything with CPUs more powerful than 1,000 megahertz. What would be the result? Well, Europe would still be using 1,000 megahertz computers, while the rest of the world would be using whatever they're using today, right? That is the risk of having the AI Act, and it's already happening. Facebook, or Meta, is going to release soon their multi-model version of Llama 3, so a new powerful model. That model used much more than 10 to the 25 flops, floating point operations. So they already announced that it will, although it's open source, right? Everyone will be able to build on it. It will not be allowed to be used by developers in Europe. So what's going to happen is the whole world, startups, like the Legal Flight type of startup, they're going to take that super powerful Llama model. They're going to fine tune it for HR applications, for legal applications, for, all sorts of applications. They're going to unlock all that economic value everywhere except in Europe. In Europe, we're going to have to use older models that are not that powerful.
The startups don't have the means to have all those monitoring and assessment tools.
I mean, plus, well, two things. First, why is Facebook not releasing it in Europe? Not because it's not allowed. The AI Act does allow you to use those, right? It's just that AI Act says for risky applications, you need all sorts of extra testing and what's not, but they don't elaborate on what type of testing, right? And then that can be decided by the countries in Europe implementing the AI Act. So Meta is saying, well, that is a huge legal risk for us. We have no idea what to do with this, so let's just not release it. Apple is doing the same thing. I think next week or the week after, Apple is releasing their new iPhone, coming with Apple Intelligence, not coming to Europe, exactly for the same reasons. So we're really risking of, just getting behind the rest of the world. Exactly. So yeah, it's I would say that there is a lot of potential in Europe, but this combined with the fact that salaries for engineers are like 2 to 3 times higher in the US, you have this innovation culture. I think if we keep heading the direction we're heading in today, it's going to be very hard for us to, we'll reap the benefits of AI at some point, somehow, but it's going to be very hard for us to be the innovators and to create an $8 trillion company in Europe.
I follow that completely. Now, the challenge then is, of course, how can we prevent that from happening? What would be a positive approach? And I'll give you an extra challenge. I had a conversation with someone from IMEC not so long ago, and one of the thoughts was, is it even possible in Europe? Maybe our culture is just too risk averse, not just politically, but also in terms of people and culture, in terms of entrepreneurship. Even if we would change something in politics, will we even have the people to come up with those ideas and take those risks?
I mean, we have the people, right? It's just how do we keep them? Because most of those move to US.
And what do you mean we have the people?
We have talent. We have fantastic universities. We have, we still have a pretty good startup scene.
How does a company because you're working for a US-based company, you are in Belgium. How does a company like IPG look at it? From a global perspective, did they look at Belgium or Europe? There's a lot of talent there, or how did they look at it?
They do, but usually, and that's also what Facebook and Amazon and all the others do, is they try to get that talent while it's still cheap, and that means straight out of college, right? Yeah. You leave university, you get offers, or it's pretty easy to get a job at those companies, and they help you get a visa and move, right? It's much more difficult when you're a bit older and more experienced. So they really know when to get that talent out. I think we have a good startup scene. We have a good startup scene in Paris, a little bit in London, in Berlin. In Belgium, we're not doing bad either. The question is, why are those startups not growing into huge companies? And if they do, like Stripe, originally founded in Ireland, they move to the US or they get acquired by a US company. So what do we do to keep them here, nurture them, and help them grow? And I don't know the answer. I'm not a policymaker, but I do know that just adding more regulations and more tax, constructions, and it's not gonna increase the chance of those companies growing into the Googles. So we somehow have to find a way to make it easier.
I think keeping our talent here is one part of the puzzle. But I think another part, which is and something which I'm not sure if that is solvable, but what you see is even if there are big budgets to invest from a government perspective, then they have to cut it in 27, and then in 27 in Belgium they have to cut it in 3, and then in 3 they have to cut it for every university, for instance, a little bit, and by the end of all of it, everyone got 1 million, and you don't do a lot with that these days.
I mean, the question is also, I do actually think that Belgium, for example, that the government has been trying and has been doing a decent job, like the FWO has been investing quite a lot the past few years. The difficulty, though, is that actually the government's job, right? And can the government even solve it? What is happening in the US is that there is 100 times more VC money flowing around in the US than in Belgium, right? It's pretty tough here to actually get a decent size in investment. How do you attract more VCs? Well, you attract more VCs if you give a VC the perspective that your company is going to 100x, right? And that seldomly happens in Belgium. So you need to create this data flywheel. You need to make it possible for and easy for startups to scale and become gigantic companies. Because of that, you're going to attract VC money. Because of the VC money, those startups are going to grow faster, right? And then you don't need the few millions of taxpayer money anymore that the government can bring.
But you need to find somehow a starting point.
You have to
need to get the
it,
ball rolling. Yeah. All right, cool. Maybe to wrap it up a bit, looking a bit further in the future, how do you see this evolving? Do you see AGI happening?
I mean, there is 2 questions, right? Do I see it happening? And then once it happens, what is the outcome of that? So I don't see it happen anytime soon, right? So I'm not one of the doomers that is thinking, AGI is going to take over the world in the next 5 to 10 years at all. I think we're very far from that. Large language models.
Maybe to be clear, what do you see as AGI? What's for you the description of AGI?
Well, AGI, for me, is intelligence that can improve itself or can be used to create new intelligence recursively, so that at some point you have an intelligence that can do more than a human being, right? And then there is no stopping to it in theory, right? Again, today generative models are just a small component. They're short-term memory, which is fantastic. It's an incredible invention already. It's super useful, but it's just a short-term memory. We're not able to have a reasoning system, a planning system yet, right? And there's no clear path to it. A lot of research. It might be there in 5 years. It might be there in 50 years, right? Neural networks were being researched 20 years ago, and it took much longer than anyone thought it would to even get to the current state. So I'm not thinking about that too much, honestly, because there is no clear path to an AGI. I think once there is a clear path, we should start worrying about it. Now, the second question, though, is it going to happen? Well, yeah, it is going to happen. Even if it's in 50 years, at some point, there will be AGI. And then what is the impact of that on our society? And Nobody knows, right? But one of the things I'm thinking about recently is a while back, Sam Altman from OpenAI funded an organization that did a big experiment around UBI, Universal Basic Income. And so they gave 1,000 people in the US $1,000 a month for free, and just measured the outcomes. And they selected those people to make sure they were not like ultra rich or ultra poor, or like try to get a good sample of the population. And the outcome that they saw is that compared to the control group that didn't get $1,000, the people that did get it on average went more to the doctor, more to hospitals, more to the dentist, and spent more time on their health, on being more healthy. They spent more time and effort on things like, you would maybe expect the opposite, but on things like budget planning, thinking about your pension, thinking about, how should you actually handle your money. Spend more time on thinking and planning for the future. What do they want to do, want to become? All the things that actually should be important, but that you cannot do because you're working 8, 10, 12, 15 hours a day, right? And you just don't have time to think about your health and your future, etc. So that's a super interesting outcome. So now what's going to happen if you actually have an AGI and if our jobs do get replaced, right? Because now we're at a stage, it's funny, science fiction writers for a long time were always about, when we have artificial intelligence, the first jobs that are going to go away are the ones that are like, plumbing, electricians, and all of that. We see the opposite happening, right? First job that are getting automated are more like lawyers and doctors and software engineers, and for now it's just giving those people an assistant to be better at their job. But yes, once there is AGI, a lot of those jobs bit by bit will be replaced. So if that happens, imagine then you have a world where working becomes optional. If you have a big idea, you can work with AI to execute it. That will still happen, and that will still be how people get rich or get name and fame. But it's optional because your day-to-day doesn't require work anymore. The society is being worked by AI agents. So then how do you earn money if you don't have to work anymore? I think the only way, and hence the experiment from Sam Altman, the only way to make it work is actually having a universal basic income. So imagine the world just runs 10 times more efficient, 100 times more efficient through AI agents. Everyone gets a universal basic income. Everyone focuses on their health, on being more happy, whatever. So everyone is basically focused on their health, focused on their long-term future, while the actual work in the world, in the economy, is largely automated and happens through agents.
Yeah, but so I imagine there's that might end up in a very utopian future, but at the same time, a very dystopian future. So what's yours? How do you see that as a utopian? And let's maybe start with the dystopian one and positively. What's the dystopian and utopian future you see if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, the risk of something like that is if people don't make money anymore because they don't work anymore, the agents work. And the agents are probably owned by companies that pay taxes. A lot of taxes go to the government, right? And the government pays those UBI salaries. What is the risk of that? The risk is that we all suddenly become super dependent on the government for our salaries, right? And the government is going to have to put some controls in place, right? Today, if you don't work after a certain period of time, you're not eligible for any type of salary, not even for the government, right? In the future, if labor is not a currency anymore, what is going to be the currency? There needs to be something, right? And it's not unthinkable that currency becomes social behavior. If you misbehave, if you don't follow the rules, if you don't get vaccinated, if you do anything that the government doesn't like, it's almost a social credit score type of situation. You're not eligible for UBI. Now add to that other innovations. We don't have to get into that, but that are happening on the side. Things like central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. So Europe specifically is pushing very hard to introduce a CBDC, meaning cash money completely goes away. It's not just the digital money we have today. A CBDC is actually something that can be tracked to the individual purchase, right? So the government knows exactly what you purchase at what time, right? And so if a UBI means you get paid in CBDCs, the government can control exactly who gets the money, when they get the money, and only you get the money if you follow the rules. And so you get this kind of dystopian surveillance state control government type of environment. So that's the dystopian outcome of AGI.
Yeah. And what would be your utopian one?
Well, I wish I had a better answer on the utopian one than the dystopian one. I don't know. I mean, naively, I think all of us focusing on on the future, the long-term benefits of life is gonna be good for all of us, right? That means poverty should go away, child poverty, or that should go away. I think equity should go up. So all of that would be great for society. The only thing we have to do to avoid the dystopian story is that we as a society, before we get to AGI, we have to make sure we don't erode our democracy, our freedom of speech, a whole bunch of things that are kind of up to debate these days, right? Not just in Europe, also in the US, in the whole world. So I think we're kind of in this very critical area of defining how do we as a society need to operate so that once AGI is there is no way that a government could even become this totalitarian organization.
To be honest, I'm feeling that you're a bit negative on the future, or that you are at least very cautious about it. Can I say that?
Cautious, yes. Negative, not. So I'm not in the camp. You kind of have two camps today, right? There is the Elon Musk camp that is like, well, we have to, and Gary Marcus is another one of those. Like, we have to regulate, we have to keep things in control because it's too dangerous. Then there is the Jan LeCun camp that is saying, like, guys, we're nowhere near AGI, right? Let's keep building, let's keep accelerating. It's doing so much good in the world. And let's just make sure that we keep an eye on it, and as a society work towards being ready for it once there is a clear path. So I'm more in that camp, but I'm definitely not naive thinking that AGI by default will save us all, right? We do have to be careful.
And so, but putting that in the political, because I'm trying to understand how you look at it. Like, there's a lot happening. That's what you're saying. We're a critical point. Disentangle that a little bit. What's the critical point? I
think it's very hard to even think about it. I know, and it's quite a while ago, and I don't know, I can't remember exactly. I think it was Andrew Ng that at some point answered a similar question, but like years ago already, saying thinking about something like AGI is like thinking about overpopulation on Mars. It's going to happen at some point, but there is no clear path to it at all today. Right? We probably don't have to put regulation in place today to avoid overpopulation on Mars. Once we're getting anywhere near that, we do have to think about it for sure. But I think it's too far away and too unclear right now.
So the idea of the exponential speed and suddenly singularity kind of stories, that's not something that you believe that will happen. It's not going to be shoot up and then we can't keep up anymore. Because that's a bit of that's what is thriving or feeding the idea of we need to be fast.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been a single moment in history, despite what the movies try to make us believe, where an invention was a eureka moment. Even things like the steam machine and the internet and all the big inventions were always a long, very long process with big teams worldwide, step-by-step process. And as long as research is open and as long we keep an eye on it, that's how eventually AGI will happen.
Yeah, but you could say that this time it's different because it's about intelligence and it might make itself smarter, which is a completely different element than internet can't make itself more connected. That's because there's no, but with AGI, there might be a point where it can make itself smarter. And then the question is, what's going to hold it back? Is that a valid argument, or how do you look at that?
In a way, I think even there you're gonna get kind of at some point. It's not like there will be this small 5-person team somewhere, whatever, in Google, that suddenly runs out the lab saying, we have AGI, we invented it, right? That's not how it happens. So there will be improvements. There will be, at some point, agents that start self-improving. Actually, there has been research about that for many years, right? Where there are agents that actually can program new agents and that can keep improving. And then after some iterations, they break down. They start making mistakes. So there will be progress, and they will at some point not break down after 3 iterations, and they will be smarter and smarter. And at some point, they will be close to a human being. And at some point, we're going to have to wonder then, like, oh, feels like we're, getting in dangerous territory here. And then we have to start to worry about regulation. But it's not like we're going to go from nothing at all to a super intelligence without a lot of intermediate steps and red flags that everyone is going to see.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. I think it was very interesting. I think I learned a lot about marketing, about AI. AI is helping. Your view on how we're going to a more autonomous AI, and hopefully your utopian future. Thanks a lot.
Let's avoid that. Thank you.
Thanks. Ciao.